Welcome to Big People, Mini Bios. My name is Yuliy Tsymbal, and on this podcast, I cover the mini biographies of influential, world-changing individuals. Stick around to get encouraged and inspired. Today's episode is about a man who has written over 30 books across numerous genres. He's regarded as one of the intellectual giants of the 20th century. He's a peculiar man because he was a modern man who hated being modern. He was out of place in his society, which was unbelieving, machine-loving, and trend-following. In fact, he referred to himself as a sort of dinosaur. He couldn't and didn't type, he didn't carry a watch, and he pretty much never drove a car. Despite his distaste for modern times, he ended up influencing the people of his age greatly and continues to influence thinkers and readers today. His name is Clive Staples Lewis. He was born in Belfast, Ireland on November 29th, 1898. He was Irish, although most people know him as an English writer. You might know him as C.S. Lewis, but he actually went by Jack. And that's because when his dog Jaxie was killed by a car, the 4-year-old Lewis adopted the name Jack and never looked back. Jack was how he was known by all his friends. So to help acquaint you with him more personally, I'll refer to him as Jack throughout most of this episode. Growing up, Jack was often bullied for not being able to play sports or throw a ball. He only had one joint in his thumb, which restricted some of his movement. So what else did he have to turn to but reading and education, both of which were highly valued in the Lewis household. Jack's father, Albert Lewis, was a well-off solicitor, and his mother, Florence Lewis, graduated from a university at a time when it was not common for women to earn degrees. Naturally, Jack and his older brother Warren became avid readers like their folks. Jack grew up with books on all subjects. He could read whatever he wanted without any restrictions. He was actually something of a prodigy. He was reading by the time he was 3, and by the time he had turned 5 years old, he and his older brother had already begun writing stories about a fantasy land they imagined. They called it the Kingdom of Boxen, where Jack imagined animals who dressed up and could become medieval knights, and Warnie imagined a fictionalized and industrialized India. You can see where Jack got the inspiration to later write the Chronicles of Narnia and to become a professor of medieval literature. Unfortunately, Jack's world of fun and fantasy couldn't prevent his real life from becoming a nightmare. He lost his mother to cancer at 9 years old, which brought an end to the happy days of his childhood. His father immediately sent him to boarding school in England, which didn't help Jack in his time of loss and loneliness. Going to England after such a traumatic event made him feel out of place on the island of Great Britain. His father's well-intentioned but misguided actions of sending Jack away surely contributed to their disconnected and soured relationship in the years to come. Jack hated the schools in England. It probably didn't help matters that his school's headmaster was later committed to a psychiatric hospital. Some of you thought that your teachers were insane. Well, Jack's actually was. To cope with the trials of English schools, Jack retreated into works of fantasy, which offered him a romantic escape from his misery. Things took a turn for the better when Jack was taken under the wing of his father's former mentor, William T. Kirkpatrick. Kirkpatrick had a reputation for aggressive teaching leadership. He was immensely skilled in teaching Latin, Greek, modern languages, and mathematics. He used all these skills to prepare his students for university. He was also theologically trained through the Presbyterian Church. Jack's father, Albert Lewis, studied under Kirkpatrick in college before Kirkpatrick became a private tutor. Later, when Albert's eldest son, Warnie Lewis, wasn't doing very well in school, he sent him to be tutored by Kirkpatrick as well. After Warnie's tutoring was done, Albert Lewis then sent Jack to Kirkpatrick as well, because Jack wasn't fitting in at school. Kirkpatrick chose to subject the younger Lewis to an unusually intense course of study that combined the great books with philosophy of all ages up to the present. His goal was to create a significant scholar of the 20th century. Needless to say, he succeeded. And on the side, his private goal was to pass on his ex-Calvinistic, no longer Christian worldview to Jack through training him in formal logic. At this time in his life, Jack readily agreed with his mentor's worldview. During his studies underneath Kirkpatrick, Jack not only picked up his tutor's reading and writing abilities, but also his atheistic belief. Though Jack eventually departed from his old tutor's stance toward God, he remained gratefully indebted to Kirkpatrick for his intense training and devotion to Jack's intellectual growth. There's good reason to believe that the old Professor Kirk in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was written in striking resemblance of Jack's tutor Kirkpatrick as a tribute to him. It's fascinating how God can use non-believers to train, equip, and bless believers, even if their intentions are completely ungodly. Indeed, God is able to make all things work out for good. In 1917, Jack had just started school at the University College, Oxford, when he enlisted in the British Army. At this point, World War I had been raging on for 3 years. When he arrived for officers' training, Jack met his roommate Patty Moore, whom he quickly became friends with. Jack and Patty made each other a promise that if one of them died, they'd take care of the other's family. Jack was sent off as an officer to the front line in the Somme Valley in France on his 19th birthday. He had his whole life ahead of him, but he knew that he was facing certain death. He had already heard about all the bloodshed in the trenches from the previous years of war. In 1918, during the Battle of Arras, Jack was injured in 3 different places by shrapnel. As it turns out, this was the most fortunate thing that could have happened to him, because his injuries took him away from the trenches and saved his life. Jack's friend Patty Moore, however, was not so fortunate and was killed in battle. Jack's experience of war in the trenches further solidified his view on God and religion as either entirely made up, or if real, then Jack was convinced that God and religion must be evil. When he did later become a Christian and wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, you could see the themes of war he'd lived through, like heroism and sacrifice, permeating his stories. You could also detect his disillusionment with humans having any chance at winning or stopping war, as in his books, the Christ-like character Aslan, the lion, wins the war, and not the human characters. In 1920, Jack returned from the war when he was about 20 years old and resumed his studies at Oxford. He had a room in his college, but to keep his promise to his deceased roommate and friend, Patty Moore, he chose to stay with Patty's mother, Mrs. Jenny Moore. She became like a motherly figure to him. However, as with any well-known celebrity, rumors are bound to swirl around. There has been some speculation that Jack, who was 20, and Jenny Moore, who was 46, started a romantic relationship before he became a Christian. However, there is no definitive evidence for these claims. Others believe, based on excerpts from Warney's diary, that Mrs. Moore took advantage of Jack's promise to her son and bossed him around as if he were her housemaid. Still others believe Mrs. Moore and Jack had nothing other than a most loving and gracious relationship as mother and son. One thing is certain. Jack kept his promise to his friend Patty. He lived with Mrs. Moore for 30 years, taking care of her and all her needs until her dying breath. About 5 years after he returned from the war, Jack became a fellow and tutor at Magdalen College, Oxford. He would hold this position for about 30 years. At the time that he assumed this position as a professor, English was not seen as a serious subject to be studied. However, he was determined to change that. He became a very popular lecturer. The university frequently had difficulty providing large enough lecture halls for him. Jack was adored by most of his students. One of his former pupils recounted that Jack threw them jolly parties with lots of booze. I guess that's one way to make English a more popular subject to study. Today, Jack is known most of all for his theological contributions. But as you've heard, theology wasn't his actual job. He was a scholar of medieval literature and a teacher. This just goes to show that you can make great contributions to the kingdom of heaven even outside of your actual job, if not through your job. The Oxford academics didn't like that their English fellow began writing popular theology works. Unfortunately, this meant that he was passed over for numerous promotions. In 1929, about 4 years into becoming a fellow in Oxford, Jack's father, Albert Lewis, fell ill. Albert Lewis had never fully recovered from the grief of losing his wife, and his erratic and sometimes cruel behavior alienated him from his sons. Jack had a difficult relationship with his dad, and they didn't reconcile until he was near his death. Jack actually considered his silence toward his father in the last decade of his father's life his greatest sin. Now this brings us to Jack's conversion, the process of which started the same year his father passed away. Jack was an atheist for the first half of his life, and he did not give up his view on God and religion easily. In fact, he described himself as the most reluctant convert to the faith. When he was 17, he told a Christian friend of his this: "I believe in no religion. There's absolutely no proof for any of them, and from a philosophical standpoint, Christianity is not even the best. When Jack turned 30 years old, everything changed. In 1929, he was sitting on a bus in Oxford and had an internal battle. He felt he was shutting something out. By the end of the bus ride, he surrendered and believed there was a God. He became a theist. And about 2 years after that, he placed his faith in Jesus Christ. He later wrote to his same childhood Christian friend, "Christianity is God expressing himself through what we call real things, namely the actual incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection." What happened? How did Jack go from a firm atheist to a believer in Jesus? Well, it didn't happen overnight. One of the first influences that started slowly chipping away at Jack's unbelief was the works of other Christians. In particular, he found G.K. Chesterton, an English writer, philosopher, and lay theologian, especially convincing. Through authors like G.K. Chesterton, Jack slowly began to see Christianity as sensible. When he later read the Gospels for himself, he was astonished to find them to be quite believable. The writers, it seemed to him, were too unimaginative to have made everything up. In addition to his personal studies, Jack's friends played a pivotal role in his coming to the faith. He couldn't get over the fact that some of the brightest minds teaching alongside him in Oxford were believers in God. One of those professors and friends was J.R.R. Tolkien, who was a Roman Catholic. Tolkien played perhaps the biggest, or at least most final role in leading Jack to the faith. He helped Jack see that Christianity was the one true myth out of all the myths and stories in the world. All the other myths were just an echo that pointed toward Christ. After numerous such conversations, Jack finally believed and became a Christian. But much to the disappointment of Tolkien, however, Jack did not become a Roman Catholic. In addition to Tolkien, Jack regularly met with other friends who also helped shape him and his work. This group of friends called themselves the Inklings. This was a group of like-minded Christian authors, thinkers, and scholars. They met every week for 13 years, on Thursday evenings and Tuesday mornings. They would get together at a local pub called the Eagle and the Child. They'd drink and discuss literature and theology. Their gatherings and lively discussions helped them maintain hope in the midst of a disillusioned world. One of the primary focuses of the Inklings was reading aloud their works in progress for criticism. Apparently, they often experienced disagreement, and members of the group sometimes had an intense dislike for each other's work. Jack, in fact, destroyed his first children's novel after receiving some critique from his friends. It was possibly the first version of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But as you'll hear later, this didn't negatively impact his final release of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Some of the works that the Inklings heard and criticized included the first drafts of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and Lewis's book, The Great Divorce. Jack actually played a role in encouraging Tolkien to finish The Lord of the Rings through some of his writer's blocks and dry spells. The Inklings were a dedicated group of friends whose gatherings still influence the world today. Makes you wonder what you and your friends can accomplish. As for his own works, one of Jack's first contributions was a poem titled Dimer, which was published in 1926. Jack had always dreamed of becoming a notable poet. Dimer took him 10 whole years to write, but it attracted very little attention and was unsuccessful. Can you imagine if he stopped there? Fortunately, this failure didn't stop him from writing the works that we know him for today. His first successful work of fiction is titled Out of the Silent Planet, which was published in 1938. In this book, Jack wove Christian allusions and themes together. This was followed by 2 equally successful books, and these 3 novels together form one of the earliest of science fiction trilogies. They center on an English linguist who voyages to Mars and Venus and becomes involved in a cosmic struggle between good and evil in the solar system. During World War II, in 1941, Jack gave highly popular radio broadcasts on Christianity, which won many converts. These broadcasts made him a well-known figure in England, and his speeches were later collected and published in the work Mere Christianity, later in 1952. Another work of C.S. Lewis's was the Screwtape Letters, a work of fiction which consisted of 31 letters in which an elderly, experienced devil named Screwtape instructs his junior, Wormwood, in the subtle art of tempting a young Christian convert. It became a bestseller, and it's the book that made Jack a recognizable name in the United States. An important event occurred in 1948. The Socratic Society was a Christian debating club that Jack often attended to debate for the philosophical implications of Christianity. In this particular debate, unlike the others, his opponent refuted one of his conclusions. This was surprising, considering his opponent was a Catholic, and thus presumably on his side of things concerning religion versus secular viewpoints. After this debate, Jack didn't really write much apologetic work, although he did revise his book Miracles to address the point brought up by his opponent. There is a debate over whether or not this event was the real cause of Jack's decision to mainly write fantasy from there on out. Regardless, the next decade saw him write some of his most popular books yet. In the 1950s, he released the Chronicles of Narnia. It's a series of 7 fantasy novels following the adventures of children in the world of Narnia, a place with magic, mythical beasts, and talking animals. The books span the entire history of Narnia, from its creation in The Magician's Nephew to its eventual destruction in the last battle. The Chronicles of Narnia is regarded as a classic of children's literature and is Jack's best-selling work, selling over 100 million copies in 47 different languages. Jack gave away all the royalties from his books through a charitable trust. In 2018, very recently, Netflix purchased all the rights to the Chronicles of Narnia books for producing their own reboot of shows and films. There is some talk that a likely release date is either late 2022 or sometime in 2023. With over 3,000 characters in the series, there's plenty of content for entertaining adaptations. Jack actually wrote the Chronicles of Narnia for his goddaughter, but she had already grown up by the time it was completely finished, so he wrote this quote, which has become well known today. "Someday, you'll be old enough to start reading fairy tales again." And regardless of how old you are, dear listener, you are not too old to enjoy the Chronicles of Narnia. In 1954, Jack also wrote a volume on the 16th century English literature for Oxford. It became a classic. The same year, he left Oxford and accepted the position of professor of medieval and Renaissance English at the University of Cambridge, which was a position tailor-made for him. Jack actually wouldn't have gone to Cambridge if it wasn't for his friend Tolkien. He needed to take care of his alcoholic brother Warnie, so Jack couldn't live in Cambridge. But Tolkien wrote the university and let them know that Lewis would go there if he didn't have to live there. They told him he could simply commute. That resolved the issue and ushered in Jack's final and happiest years of teaching. In 1956, Jack authored Till We Have Faces, A Myth Retold. Just for fun, I want to tell you about this lesser-known work of Jack's. This is a retelling of the myth of Cupid and Psyche from the viewpoint of one of Psyche's sisters. It's the least popular of his novels, but the most highly praised by literary critics. Another significant event in the 1950s played a very key part in Jack's life. This was the decade when he met Joy Davidman. Joy Davidman was a feisty Jewish woman from the Bronx in New York City. She became a Christian in part through reading Lewis's books. They began exchanging letters in 1950. About 4 years later, Joy Davidman and her husband, who had been unfaithful to her, were divorced. She moved to England and became a close friend of Jack's. In 1956, Joy Davidman found out that her visitor's visa was not going to be renewed, and she would have to leave England. To help out his friend, Jack kindly offered a platonic and private wedding ceremony so that she could become a British citizen and stay in England. But before long, Jack and Joy found themselves in love, despite the fact that he was 17 years older and had been a lifelong bachelor. In 1957, they had another wedding ceremony, only this time it was out of true love. They exchanged vows at her hospital bedside after she received a devastating diagnosis of cancer. Joy Davidman practically spent her final days dying in the arms of her husband. After her passing, Jack was devastated and brought down into one of the lowest points of his life. In the midst of his anguish, he wrote a book titled A Grief Observed. In it, he grieves his loss like a modern psalmist, asking God where he is in the midst of his pain. The short book contains Jack's raw emotions and struggles. His subsequent letters do show that his faith wasn't destroyed through this event, but it was certainly tested. A Grief Observed later became the inspiration for the Academy Award-winning movie Shadowlands, starring Anthony Hopkins. Jack wrote other books that I don't have the time to cover here, including The Abolition of Man, which is a book on how modern education was corrupting young minds by doing away with moral values and objective truth. He also wrote Surprised by Joy, his personal account of his journey for joy from atheism to Christianity, and many more books. As I said in the beginning of this episode, he wrote over 30 books, and I've only mentioned less than half of them in this episode so far. That should give you an idea of how much he wrote in his lifetime. As much as Jack wrote for publishing, he wrote even more in private. He was committed to respond to each and every single piece of fan mail he ever received. He wrote back to thousands of fans. If his books had an impact on the world at large, there's no telling how much his personal and unique letters impacted the fans that he wrote back to. There's no telling how many souls he may have drawn near to God merely through responding to his fan mail. To give you one example of this from a person you might know a little bit about, I'll tell you about Timothy Keller's wife. Kathy Keller became a Christian largely through reading the Narnia books. She wrote to Jack as a little girl to tell him how wonderful his books were. He responded to her 4 times. This just illustrates how devoted he was to his fans. As you'll recall, responding to fan mail is also how he ultimately met his own wife, Joy Davidman. You never know how much the smallest gesture might impact the life of another one, let alone your own life. As with every inspiring individual whose biography is covered on this podcast, Jack had his flaws. According to John Piper, Jack didn't believe in the inerrancy of Scripture. He defaulted to logical arguments more naturally than to biblical exegesis. He's not necessarily someone you would turn to for understanding biblical doctrines. However, he esteemed the truth. He admired the grace and power of God. He portrayed the wonders of the incarnation. And Jack saw the value in doctrine and valued reason and precision of thought. These things help his readers fall more in love with Christ and the Bible, and even arrive at the right conclusions despite some of his own improper stances. According to John Piper, it is Jack's experience of joy and his defense of the truth that have cemented his influence in the Christian world. And for John Piper personally, Jack's ability to connect logic and joy, reasoning and feeling, were instrumental in helping him understand God. Jack's works continue to do the same for people today. Jack died on November 22nd, 1963. This date happened to coincide with the assassination of the U.S. President John F. Kennedy. As you can imagine, this meant Lewis received little media coverage and died practically in secret. Sadly, Warney was also too drunk to tell anyone about the time of his brother's funeral. Thus, Jack passed away very quietly. However, his works have clearly continued to speak to many generations after him, leaving him anything but forgotten. Here's a final quote from C.S. Lewis. "If we find ourselves with the desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that we were made for another world." I just love this quote because I think it depicts C.S. Lewis's love for fantastical worlds and his use of these fantastical worlds to depict a true world, a heaven that exists after this life. If you'd like to learn more about C.S. Lewis, or Jack as I've been referring to him throughout this episode, there are a few books out there on him, one of which is The Narnian, and there are also the 2 autobiographical works of his, Surprised by Joy and A Grief Observed. There's also a movie, as I've referred to earlier in this episode, called Shadowlands, and there's also a documentary on YouTube by Absolute History, a really, really good documentary on him. If you'd like to check out another podcast which is all about C.S. Lewis, you can visit this podcast called Visit Pines with Jack, the C.S. Lewis podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in to the second episode of Big People Mini Bios. As for our next episode, it'll be about a woman who inspired generations of evangelical Christians with her incredibly compassionate missionary work across the globe. See you then.